She stood before the door of the house she had built with her own hands only, to find the key no longer fit the lock. It wasn't because the door was broken. It was because her son had changed the lock the night before. Evelyn Carter, a woman who had sacrificed her entire life to build a career and raise her only child, now stood like a stranger outside her own home. If you are watching this video, please hit the like button and subscribe right now so you don't miss out on future shocking stories. Drop a comment with the city or country you're watching from. I want to know just how far this story has traveled around the world. And be sure to stay until the end, because you'll never guess what Evelyn actually had in store for her treacherous son. The morning I stood outside my own house, I kept thinking about the roses. 42 years ago, I planted a climbing rose bush along the left side of the porch. Pink one's not the deep red kind you see in flower shops, but that soft, almost apologetic pink that blooms in early May and makes the whole front of a house look like a painting. My husband Gerald said I was wasting time. He said we had a business to run, accounts to balance, invoices to chase. He said roses were for people who didn't have anything better to do. He was wrong about a lot of things, Gerald was, but he was right about the work. I remember standing at that porch on the morning after his funeral, looking at those roses and thinking at least I still have this. At least I still have something I built with my own hands that nobody can take from me. I didn't know at the time how naive that thought was. I was 68 years old when I found out what my son had done. 68 years old, in a gray cardigan, holding a canvas tote bag with 2 changes of clothes and a toiletry kit inside it, standing on the front porch of the home I had owned for 31 years, and the key I had carried on the same keyring since 1993 would not turn in the lock. I tried it 3 times, slow then faster, then with both hands, like maybe I was doing something wrong. Like maybe the problem was me. Like maybe I was confused or forgetful or had somehow picked up the wrong key in the morning rush. But there was no morning rush. There was just me and the quiet street and the sound of a neighbor's sprinkler 2 doors down and the terrible, clarifying realization that the lock had been changed. Nathan had changed the lock, my son, my only child. Let me back up, because you're not going to understand how badly this hurt unless you know who I was before that morning. Unless you know what I built and what I gave away and exactly how much I trusted the wrong person. I grew up poor, not the kind of poor that becomes romantic in hindsight. Not we didn't have much, but we had each other poor. The real kind. The kind where you go to school in shoes a size too small because new ones cost money you don't have, and you eat the same 3 meals rotating for months, and you learn very young that the world does not automatically offer you anything. You have to take it, you have to earn it, and then you have to protect it. My parents came to Ohio from nothing. My father worked in a machine shop for 30 years. My mother cleaned office buildings at night and sewed alterations on the side. They never complained. They never asked anyone for help. And when I was 17 and said I wanted to open a fabric supply business out of a garage, my mother, who had exactly $300 in a coffee can under the kitchen sink, handed it to me without hesitating. Don't waste it, she said. I didn't. Carter Textile Supply grew slowly. It wasn't glamorous, I want to be clear about that. It wasn't some startup success story. It was 30 years of early mornings and late nights and learning the hard way that a handshake is worth nothing without a contract, and a contract is worth nothing if you don't read every line. Gerald came on board in year 4, and he was good with numbers in the way I was good with people. Together we made something that worked. By the time we were in our 50s, Carter Textile Supply employed 63 people, had 3 regional distribution contracts, and owned a small commercial property on the east side of the city that we leased to a printing company. It wasn't an empire, but it was ours. Every dollar of it earned, every asset paid for, every relationship built from scratch. And we had Nathan. Nathan was born late in our marriage. I was 37. Gerald was 41. We were already too tired, honestly, to be new parents. But we loved him the way people love things they waited for. Completely, maybe too completely. I won't pretend Nathan was a difficult child. He wasn't. He was charming, quick, funny, in that easy way that makes people lean towards you at parties. He had Gerald's head for numbers and my gift for reading a room. He grew up comfortable, not spoiled, I thought, but comfortable, and when he graduated college with a business degree, I was the one who insisted he join the company. Let him find his own way, Gerald said. His own way is here, I said. We built this for him. That was my first mistake. Believing that because I had built something for someone, they understood its cost. Gerald died in March 7 years ago. Heart attack. 63 years old, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, alone in his office with a cup of coffee gone cold on his desk. Paramedics said he probably didn't feel much. I don't know if that's true, or if they just say that to widows because it's easier than the alternative. I felt plenty. For 6 months after the funeral, I ran the company alone. I went through the motions, signed the papers, attended the meetings, paid the payroll, but I was hollowed out in a way that I didn't know how to explain to people who hadn't been through it. Grief like that doesn't just hurt. It makes you question what you're doing and why, and whether the whole structure of your life still makes sense, now that the person you built it with is gone. Nathan was there during those months. He showed up. He helped. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and went through the accounts and said the right things about honoring Gerald's legacy and continuing what we'd built. And I want to be honest, I was grateful. I was tired and sad and 61 years old, and my son was stepping up in a way that made me feel like maybe some things were going to be okay. That's what I thought. In those months that things were going to be okay. What I didn't see, what I couldn't see, or maybe didn't want to, was the way Nathan's eyes moved when we talked about the numbers. The way he'd circle back to questions about the commercial property. The way he started referring to our accounts instead of your accounts in a way that was so gradual I barely noticed the shift until it had already happened. I want to say I should have seen it coming. Maybe I should have. But there's something about grief that narrows your vision. You trust the people closest to you more than usual because you need to trust someone, and you've just lost the person you trusted most. Nathan knew that. I don't know if he calculated it consciously, but he knew it. Over the following 2 years, I transferred more and more of the operational control to him. It seemed natural. It seemed smart. Even I was getting older. The business needed younger energy, and Nathan had been working in it long enough to understand the operations. I didn't hand him everything at once. It happened in pieces. A signature here, a power of attorney there, a shared account just to make it easier. The frog in the water that doesn't know it's boiling, that old cliche I used to think that was a saying for foolish people. People who weren't paying attention. I was paying attention. I just trusted the wrong person. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Thursday evening in October, about 8 months ago. Nathan came over for dinner, something he did less frequently than he used to, though I'd stopped pointing that out because it only seemed to create tension. He sat at my kitchen table with a glass of wine and what I would later recognize as a rehearsed ease, like someone who had practiced being casual. "Mom," he said, "I've been thinking about the house." I was at the stove. "What about it?" "It's a lot for you to maintain by yourself. 6 bedrooms, the yard, the upkeep, I worry about you." I turned around and looked at him. "I've maintained this house for 31 years, Nathan." "I know," he smiled. That smile, the one that looked like Gerald's and nothing like Gerald's at the same time. "But you were always doing it with someone else. It's different now." He wasn't wrong about that. Maintaining the house alone was more work than it used to be. The gutters had needed cleaning for 2 months, and I kept putting it off. The back porch had a board that was starting to rot, and I hadn't called anyone to fix it. He knew these things because I'd mentioned them, and he filed them away, and now he was using them. I see that now. I didn't see it then. "What are you suggesting?" I asked. "Just let me take care of a few things, organizationally. I've been talking to an accountant about restructuring the estate to reduce your tax liability, and it would simplify things if the house was under a management structure I have access to. Just temporarily, I repeated, until everything is organized properly. A month, maybe 2. You could stay with Margaret, my older sister, or I could help you find a short-term rental. Somewhere comfortable. I'd cover it, obviously. I should have said no. I want to be very clear about that. The woman I was before Gerald died would have said no immediately, and asked 16 questions and told Nathan to send her the paperwork so she could have it reviewed by someone else. That woman would never have agreed to leave her own house based on a dinner table conversation. But the woman I was that October evening had been tired for 2 years, and Nathan was her son, and she actually thought that he was trying to help. "Just for a month," I said. "Just until things are organized," he said. I packed a bag that night. I told myself I was being flexible. Modern. I told myself that this was what it looked like to trust your family. I kissed Nathan on the cheek at the door, and I drove to my sister Margaret's house, and I slept in her guest room, and I told myself this was temporary. The next morning, I woke up early. I'd forgotten my blood pressure medication, left it in the upstairs bathroom in the rush to pack. I didn't want to bother Nathan about it. He had an early morning. I still had my key. I drove back to the house at 7:15. Parked in the driveway like I had done 10,000 times. Walked up the porch steps past the climbing roses that were dormant now in October, just green stems. Put my key in the lock. It didn't turn. I pulled it out and looked at it. Same key. The little notch on the bottom, from where I'd dropped it on concrete back in 2011. Same silver, slightly worn on the edges from years of use. My key, the one I'd carried for 31 years. I tried it again. Nothing. Then I tried the back door. The handle moved, but the door didn't open. The deadbolt was thrown. I went around to the garage entry. Same thing. I stood in my own driveway for a long time. My phone rang. It was Nathan, Mom, he said. I was going to call you this morning. Nathan, my voice was very quiet. I noticed that. How quiet I was. Why won't my key work a pause? Just a half second, but I've known my son his entire life, and I knew the sound of that pause. It wasn't surprise, it was calculation. I had to change the locks temporarily, he said. For the insurance assessment, the assessor's need. Don't, I said. Mom, don't, I said again. Just tell me the truth. Another pause. Longer this time. The house is under the estate management structure now, he said. It's complicated, Mom. And I'll explain everything. But right now there are legal reasons why. Nathan, my voice cracked on his name and I hated it. Hated the way it gave him something. Hated that I couldn't hold it together for even this. Are you telling me I can't come into my own home? It's not he stopped himself, but not fast enough. Not fast enough. Say that again, I whispered, but he didn't. And the silence that stretched out between us on that phone call was worse than anything he could have said, because silence is a confirmation in its own way. Silence is what people reach for when the truth is too ugly to speak out loud. I hung up the phone. I stood in my driveway with my canvas tote bag and my useless key. I looked at the house I had built. I looked at the roses, bare-stemmed in the October morning. And I made myself a promise. I did not cry. I want you to understand that. I felt something move through me, something cold and clarifying and very, very old. And I made myself a promise right there on that driveway, standing outside a door that used to be mine. I was not going to beg. I was not going to call back. I was not going to stand on that porch and pound on the door of my own house like a woman who had lost her mind along with her home. I was going to do what I had always done, from the time I was 17 years old with 300 borrowed dollars and a garage that smelled like machine oil. I was going to survive this, and then I was going to rebuild. And if my son thought he knew what I was worth, if he thought he had seen the full picture of what I built and what I protected and what I had planned for exactly the kind of moment when the people you love stop being safe, he was about to find out that he did not know his mother nearly as well as he thought he did. I walked back to my car. I put the canvas bag on the passenger seat. I sat for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel, looking at the house, looking at the roses. Then I started the car and drove away. Margaret didn't say I told you so. That was the thing about my older sister. She had her faults, plenty of them, and we'd spent decades disagreeing about everything from how to raise children to how to cook a pot roast, but Margaret understood when to keep her mouth shut. She opened the door that morning, took one look at me standing on her porch with my canvas bag and my blood pressure medication still sitting on a bathroom shelf inside a house I could no longer enter, and she just stepped aside and let me in. Coffee, she said. Please, I said. We sat at her kitchen table for a long time without talking much. Margaret poured. I wrapped both hands around the mug the way you do when you need to feel something solid. Outside her window, the neighbor's oak tree was dropping leaves in that slow, indifferent way that October trees do. Like the world had no idea anything terrible had just happened. Like seasons just continued regardless. How much did he take? Margaret finally asked. I don't know yet, I said. That's the honest answer. I don't know the full picture. Do you want me to call Richard? Richard was her husband. A retired contractor with a temper and a truck, and the kind of loyalty that would have him at Nathan's door by noon if I asked. No, I said. Not yet. Margaret looked at me over the rim of her mug. She had our mother's eyes dark, very steady, the kind that didn't look away from things. Evelyn, she said carefully, what are you going to do? I thought about that question for a long moment. I thought about all the answers I could give, the emotional ones, the furious ones, the ones that involved lawyers and police and public scenes, and the kind of family destruction that you never fully come back from. I thought about what it would feel like to call Nathan back and scream at him the way part of me very badly wanted to. Then I thought about my mother, about a coffee can under a kitchen sink and $300 given without hesitation. About a woman who had nothing and gave it anyway because she believed in the person she was giving it to. I'm going to get myself stable first, I said, and then I'm going to figure out exactly what he has and what he doesn't have. And then I'm going to decide what comes next. Margaret nodded slowly. That sounds like you, she said. I'm not going to fall apart, Margaret. I know you're not. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine for exactly 2 seconds, enough to say what she meant without making a production of it. But you're allowed to be angry. I'm furious, I said quietly. I'm the most furious I've been in 68 years. But furious doesn't help me right now. I stayed at Margaret's for 4 days. In that time, I made 3 phone calls that mattered. The first was to Dennis Hargrove, who had been our family attorney for 22 years, and who I reached on a Saturday morning, despite him being at a golf course, Because Dennis was the kind of man who answered the phone when longtime clients called, even on weekends, and because the moment I told him what had happened, I could hear him pulling off the golf course before I'd finished the second sentence. "Don't touch anything," he said. "Don't call Nathan again. Don't send messages. Don't go to the house. Let me look at what he actually filed and what he actually has legal access to. Give me until Monday." The second call was to a woman named Patricia Chen, who ran a small property management firm on the north side of the city and who I had done business with years ago when we were leasing the commercial property. Patricia had sharp eyes and a sharper memory, and she knew the rental market in ways that would take me months to learn on my own. I explained my situation in the broadest terms. I needed an apartment, reasonable size, month-to-month lease if possible, available quickly. "How quickly?" she asked. "This week," I said, a pause. "That's tight, I know. Let me see what I have." Another pause, the sound of her clicking through something. "There's a 2-bedroom on Carmichael. It's not fancy, Evelyn. Clean and it's quiet, and the building is maintained, but it's not what you're used to." "I'm not looking for what I'm used to," I said. "I'm looking for what's available." The third call was the one I sat with the longest before making. I called my financial advisor, a man named Robert Osei, who had managed the portions of my personal portfolio that were separate from the business accounts, the ones that weren't in any of the structures Nathan had talked me into over the past 2 years. Robert was thorough and careful, and when I told him I needed a complete picture of what remained in my personal accounts, what was purely mine, untouched, protected, he was quiet for a moment. "How bad is it?" he asked. "I think Nathan has access to more than I realized," I said. "I need to know exactly where the lines are." I'll pull everything together," he said. "Come in first thing Monday, 4 days." Margaret fed me and didn't ask too many questions and gave me the guest room without making me feel like a guest. And at night I lay in the dark and did the kind of thinking you can only do when everything you've taken for granted has been pulled away from under you. The kind of thinking that strips away all the comfortable stories you've been telling yourself and forces you to look at the actual facts. The actual fact was that I had let this happen in degrees. Not all at once, not in a single catastrophic moment of stupidity, but in small, incremental surrenders of control that each seemed reasonable at the time and only looked like a pattern when you lined them all up together. The signature on a document I should have read more carefully. The account access I'd shared because it was easier. The conversation where I'd said "I trust you" instead of "show me the paperwork." I wasn't stupid. I want to be clear about that, because I've met women who've been through things like this, and the first thing they do is call themselves stupid, and I refused to do that to myself. I was grieving. I was tired. I was a 68-year-old woman who had worked hard her entire life and wanted to believe that the sun she had poured that life into was worth the pouring. That's not stupidity, that's love. And love is the most exploitable thing there is. But love was also what was going to get me back on my feet. Not for Nathan's sake, not anymore, for mine. The apartment on Carmichael was on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled faintly of old carpet and other people's cooking, and the particular staleness of spaces that haven't been aired out in a while. Patricia had been right, it wasn't fancy. The kitchen was galley-style and narrow. The bedroom windows looked out onto a brick wall. The water pressure in the shower was inconsistent in the way of old buildings where the pipes had opinions. I signed the lease on a Tuesday and moved in with 2 suitcases, a box of kitchen basics that Margaret helped me put together from her own cabinets, and a folding table that Richard carried up 3 flights of stairs without being asked. The first night, I sat on the floor of the living room because I hadn't bought furniture yet, and I ate a bowl of soup from a can heated on the small stove, and I looked at the bare walls and the overhead light that buzzed slightly when it was on. And I thought, this is where I am. This is the actual bottom of it. Below this, there is nothing. Which means the only direction from here is up. I slept on a borrowed air mattress that night. I slept better than I had in years. Dennis called me Wednesday morning. I was standing at the narrow kitchen counter drinking coffee when my phone rang, and I knew from the way he started the call, without preamble, without the usual small talk, that the news was going to be complicated. "All right," he said. "Here's what I've found. Nathan has legitimate legal access to the primary business operating accounts. You signed those transfers over 18 months ago, and they were properly filed. He also has access to the joint savings account you set up after Gerald died, which now has significantly less in it than it should." Closed my eyes. How much less? From the balance at Gerald's passing to the current balance I'm looking at, approximately $400,000 drawn down over the past 14 months. 400,000. I stood very still and breathed. What else? The house, Dennis said, is more complicated. He filed a management transfer through the estate restructuring you agreed to, and a judge signed off on it because the paperwork was technically in order. Getting it reversed is possible, but it won't be fast. We're looking at months, not weeks. What does he actually control, Dennis, in clear terms? In clear terms, he controls the operating business, the primary savings, and the house is currently tied up in a structure that technically names him as managing trustee. What he does not control, and this is important, Evelyn, are your personal investment accounts, the commercial property lease income, or certain assets that were structured separately before Gerald died. How much are those worth? A pause. Altogether, substantially more than what he has access to. Property lease alone generates significant annual income. And your investment portfolio, Robert, probably gave you a better breakdown, but you are not without resources. You are not a woman who has been left with nothing. You are a woman whose son has taken a significant portion of what was accessible and hasn't yet realized what wasn't. I let that land, let myself feel it, the relief and the rage simultaneously, which is a strange combination, like being told the fire only burned half the house. Can he find out about the other assets? I asked. Not easily. They're structured in ways that don't show up in standard estate documents. He would need to specifically look, and he would need to know what to look for. Does he know what to look for? Another pause. That I can't tell you. What I can tell you is that right now, based on what I'm seeing, he believes he has the main picture. He may not realize there's a second picture entirely. Good, I said. Let's keep it that way. I want to tell you about what Nathan was doing during those weeks, because I know I found out later, piece by piece, from people who'd seen him, and from the paper trail his decisions eventually left, and it matters for understanding what came next. Nathan had moved a woman named Courtney into my house within 5 days of locking me out. I heard this from my neighbor Shirley, who had lived across the street for 20 years and who called me 10 days after I'd left because she couldn't not say something. Evelyn, Shirley said, I didn't want to interfere. You know me, I don't stick my nose in. But there's been a lot of activity over there, and I thought you should know. What kind of activity? Cars I don't recognize. A delivery van last weekend looked like furniture. And a woman about 40 maybe, dark hair. She's been coming and going like she lives there. I thanked Shirley and sat with that for a while. A woman. Furniture deliveries, activity. My house, the one I had planted roses in front of. The one Gerald and I had painted ourselves over a long summer weekend in 1998, was being refurnished and inhabited by people I didn't know while I sat in a rented apartment eating soup from a can. The rage that moved through me then was specific in a way that earlier rage hadn't been. It wasn't the hot, blinding kind. It was the cold and focused kind that doesn't dissipate, it just hardens into something useful. I called Dennis again. Is there anything legally stopping Nathan from having people in the house right now? Technically, as managing trustee, he can permit occupants, Dennis said, with a heaviness in his voice that told me he hated saying it. It's one of the things we'll address in the challenge to the trustee arrangement. But right now, no. We can't force him out or her out on that basis alone. Then we don't fight that battle yet. What battle do we fight? The one we can win, I said. The business. Here is something nobody tells you about being in your late 60s. People underestimate you constantly. And if you're smart, you learn to use that. Nathan had grown up watching me run Carter Textile Supply from the inside. He understood the day-to-day operations. He could read a balance sheet and negotiate a vendor contract and manage the operational staff. What he had never paid much attention to, because I had never made it visible, because it was mine, because Gerald and I had deliberately kept it separate from the business structures, was the foundation beneath the foundation. When you run a business for 30 years, you develop relationships that are worth more than any balance sheet line item. You develop trust with people who will take a phone call from you on a Saturday, who will give you information they wouldn't give a stranger, who remember that you were the one who extended their contract when they were struggling and didn't make them ask twice. I spent those first weeks calling in every one of those relationships, not aggressively. I want to be clear about that. I didn't go to the business contacts and declare war on my son. That's not how it works. What I did was quieter than that and more effective. I made phone calls. I had lunches. I reconnected with people I hadn't spoken to since handing over more and more of the operational reins to Nathan. And in those conversations, carefully, I began to understand what Nathan had actually done with the business in the 14 months he'd been running it. It was not good. Frank Alderman, who ran one of our 3 regional distribution contracts, told me over lunch at a diner near his office that Nathan had renegotiated the contract terms in ways that looked good on paper in the short term, but had committed the company to delivery volumes that were going to be nearly impossible to meet by the following spring. I tried to tell him, Frank said, pushing his coffee cup around. He said he had a new logistics arrangement lined up, but I haven't heard anything about it since then. and we're 4 months from the new terms kicking in. Helen Park, who managed accounts payable and had been with the company since the year Nathan started high school, called me out of the blue on a Thursday morning. "Mrs. Carter," she said. She'd always called me Mrs. Carter, even when I'd told her a dozen times to call me Evelyn. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I've been losing sleep about this, and I don't know who else to call." "What is it, Helen?" "Mr. Nathan has been drawing from the operational account in ways that she stopped. Started again. The vendor payments are getting delayed, Mrs. Carter. We have 2 suppliers who've called asking when they're going to see their invoices settled. And I don't know where the money is going. He says it's investment reallocation, but when I ask him to show me the documentation, he says he'll get it to me later, and then later never comes." I held the phone tight. "How far behind are the vendor payments?" 60 days on 2 accounts, 30 on 3 others. If the 60-day ones go to 90, we're going to start having supply chain problems. "All right, Helen, thank you for telling me. Keep this conversation between us for now." "Yes, ma'ams," she said. There was relief in her voice, the relief of someone who'd been carrying something heavy and finally set us down for a moment. So that was the picture that emerged, piece by careful piece, over those first 3 weeks in the apartment on Carmichael. Nathan had not simply stolen money and locked his mother out of her house. Nathan had taken control of a 30-year business that employed 63 people, and he was running it into the ground not maliciously, maybe, but with the carelessness of someone who had never truly understood what something cost, because he had never had to earn it from nothing. He was spending. He was making commitments the company couldn't keep. He was delaying payments that needed to be made, and he was doing it while living in my house with a woman named Courtney and telling anyone who asked that he was restructuring the family legacy. The fury I'd been managing, keeping cold and contained, and useful threatened to break its banks when Helen told me about the vendor payments. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about Frank Alderman's distribution contract, and Helen's job, and the 62 other employees who showed up every day and did their work without any idea that the man who was now running their company was burning through its foundation to fund a lifestyle he hadn't earned. I sat with that anger. I breathed through it, and then I called Dennis. "We need to move faster," I said. "Evelyn, I understand the timeline. I understand how these things work. I need to know if there's anything we can do about the business accounts separate from the house situation, because there are employees who are going to be affected if this continues, and that is not acceptable to me." Dennis was quiet for a moment. "There might be a way," he said slowly. "If we can document the financial mismanagement, the delayed vendor payments, the drawdowns that can't be accounted for, we might be able to pursue a breach of fiduciary duty claim. That's a different legal mechanism than the estate challenge. It could potentially move faster. What do we need? Documentation. Bank records if you can get them, vendor correspondence, anything that establishes a pattern of financial negligence or self-dealing." "Helen Park," I said. "She'll cooperate. You're sure?" "She called me on her own initiative at 8 in the morning to tell me about it," I said. "I'm sure all right," Dennis said. Then we build the case. There are things I'm not proud of from those weeks. I want to be honest about that because this is my story and I'm the one telling it, and I have no interest in making myself out to be someone uncomplicated. There was a night, a Tuesday, about 3 weeks in, kind of night where the air mattress I was still sleeping on seemed to be specifically designed for maximum discomfort, when I picked up my phone and pulled up Nathan's number and sat there for 20 minutes with my thumb over the call button. Not because I wanted to fight with him, not because I had anything new to say, but because he was my son. Because 31 years ago I had been in a delivery room, and they had put him in my arms and I had looked at his face and felt something I don't have adequate words for. And no amount of what he had done changed the fact that the same person who did all this terrible thing was also that same person. I didn't call him. I put the phone down and I lay on my back on the air mattress and I stared at the ceiling and I thought about the specific nature of love that exists between a parent and a child, how it is not rational, how it does not respond to evidence the way other feelings do, how you can know with complete clarity that someone has betrayed you and still, underneath all of that, underneath the cold fury and the legal strategy and the documented mismanagement and the woman named Courtney who was sleeping in your house, there is still something that simply cannot stop loving them. That's not weakness. I've decided that's not weakness. That's just the particular burden of being a mother. You carry it whether you want to or not. But love, real love, the kind that's worth anything, does not mean letting someone continue to hurt you and calling it forgiveness. Letting Nathan continue what he was doing because I loved him and it hurt too much to fight back was not love. It was surrender, and surrender was not something I had ever been built for. So I got up the next morning. I went to my narrow kitchen. I made coffee. I called Robert Ossie about the investment accounts, and I spent 2 hours going through the structures with him, understanding exactly what was mine and what was protected, and what Nathan would find if he went looking. And then I spent another hour on the phone with Dennis going over the documentation Helen had quietly been compiling. I was not going to beg. I had promised myself that on the driveway, and I kept it every single morning. But there was something else I was putting together during those weeks. Something that Dennis didn't know about yet. Something that even Margaret didn't know about that had to do with the weeks before Nathan's dinner conversation about organizing the estate. Something I had done quietly, on my own, with a different attorney in the year after Gerald died, because grief had clarified certain things for me. And one of those things was this. I had watched my husband spend 30 years building something without putting protections in place for the possibility that the people closest to him might not be trustworthy. And I had decided, in the particular clear-headedness that comes after loss, that I was not going to make the same mistake. What Nathan thought he had taken from me the full picture of the Carter estate, the complete scope of what I was worth was not the full picture, not by a long way, and I had been waiting quietly, in my apartment on Carmichael, for exactly the right moment to let him find that out. That moment was coming. I could feel it moving toward me the way you can feel a storm front before the sky changes that particular pressure in the air, that shift in the quality of the light. Nathan was spending. Nathan was making promises he couldn't keep. Nathan was drawing down accounts that had a bottom, and he was approaching that bottom faster than he knew. When he hit it, when the money he thought was endless ran dry and the debts came due and the business started showing the consequences of 14 months of carelessness, he was going to come looking for his mother. And I was going to be here, not the way he expected. Not the woman who had always been there to fix things, to smooth things over, to absorb the consequences of other people's choices, because that was what mothers did, and she was grateful for any attention she could get. He was going to find a different woman entirely. A woman who had spent 6 weeks sleeping on an air mattress in a 2-bedroom apartment on Carmichael Street, eating soup from cans, rebuilding her understanding of exactly what she owned and exactly what she could do with it. A woman who had stopped waiting to be saved because she had never in 68 years needed saving. And she wasn't up to start now. I got up that morning and bought myself a proper bed. Nothing expensive, a mattress and a simple frame from a furniture place 2 miles away that delivered the same day. I made it up with sheets I bought at the same time, and that night I slept in an actual bed in my apartment. And in the morning I woke up and made my coffee and stood at the narrow kitchen window and watched the city come awake outside and felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Ready. I felt ready. The call I had been waiting for came on a Wednesday morning 43 days after I drove away from my own driveway. I was at the narrow kitchen counter with my second cup of coffee, going through a folder of vendor correspondence that Helen had quietly forwarded to my personal email over the preceding 2 weeks, when my phone lit up with Nathan's name. I looked at it for 3 full rings, not because I was afraid of the conversation. I had been ready for this conversation for 6 weeks, but because I wanted to be entirely settled before I picked up. Entirely clear. The way you get before something important. When you stop all the inner noise and just breathe down into whatever is steadiest in you. I picked up on the 4th ring, Mom. His voice was different from the last time. That last call, the one on the driveway, the one where he'd started to say it's not your, and stopped himself, had carried a certain confidence underneath the careful phrasing. The confidence of someone who believed they had already won. This voice had none of that. This voice was tight in the way of someone trying to sound controlled and not quite managing it. Nathan, I said, I need to talk to you. A pause. In person. All right. Another pause. He'd expected more resistance, I think. Expected me to make conditions or refuse or ask questions he'd have to work through before we got to the meeting itself. When I didn't, it seemed to throw him slightly. When would work for you? Today works, I said, noon. There's a diner on Merchant Street called Halloran's. I'll be there, Halloran's, he repeated. He didn't suggest anywhere else. He didn't suggest the house, my house, which told me something about where his head was. Okay, noon. I hung up and sat for a moment with my hand still on the phone. Then I called Dennis. He wants to meet, I said. Today, noon, a beat of silence. That's fast. Something must have broken. That's what I'm thinking. Can you be available by phone this afternoon in case I need to reach you quickly? I'll clear my schedule, Dennis said. Evelyn, go in knowing what you want to say and what you don't want to say. Don't let the conversation move faster than you need it to. I know, I said, and if he starts making promises. I won't accept promises, I said. I know the difference between what someone says and what they put in writing. I learned that 30 years ago. I heard him almost smile through the phone. Yes, you did. All right. Call me after. I spent the 2 hours before noon the way I'd spent a lot of mornings those past 6 weeks going through documents, making sure I had the picture clearly in my head, checking that I understood not just what I knew, but the order in which I was willing to reveal it. There is a strategy to these conversations, and it's not about being cruel or playing games. It's about understanding that information is the most powerful thing in any negotiation, and that you never give away more than you need to, and that the person who maintains their composure longest usually controls the outcome. I put on the gray wool blazer I'd bought the week before the first new clothing I'd purchased since moving to Carmichael, and I drove to Halloran's, and got there 10 minutes early and took a booth in the back where I could see the door. Nathan walked in at 12:05. He looked bad. That's the honest thing to say. He looked bad in the specific way of people who've been sleeping poorly and worrying constantly, but are trying very hard not to show it. He'd lost weight in his face. His jacket was slightly wrinkled in a way the Nathan of 2 months ago would never have allowed. He spotted me and came over and slid into the booth across from me without taking his coat off, which told me he was too agitated to settle into the ordinary rituals of arrival. "Thanks for coming," he said. "Of course," I said. A waitress came. We both ordered coffee. We sat while she poured and moved away, and the sounds of the diner filled the space between us other conversations, the clatter of plates from the kitchen, a radio somewhere, playing something I couldn't quite make out. Nathan wrapped his hands around his coffee cup and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at me. "I've made some mistakes," he said. "I waited, with the business, with some investments. There were some decisions I made that I thought were going to work out, and they haven't. And right now, there are some cash flow problems that are." He stopped. Started again. "The vendor accounts are behind. I know Helen has probably told you." "Helen is an employee who has worked for that company for 19 years, I said. "She was worried about her job and the jobs of the people she works with. She did the right thing." Nathan's jaw tightened slightly. I wasn't criticizing her. Good. He looked back down at his coffee. "The main operating account it's significantly lower than it should be. There are some commitments I've made to a logistics partner that are going to come due in about 6 weeks, and the way the cash flow looks right now, I don't see how to meet them without another stop." Like each sentence was running him into a wall he hadn't anticipated. "I need access to additional capital, Mom. I need to know if there's something in the estate structure we can." "How much have you spent?" I said. He blut. "Of the $400,000 from the joint savings account. How much of it is left?" The color that moved into his face was not guilt exactly. It was closer to the particular shame of being seen doing something you thought no one knew about. "I don't know the exact, Nathan." My voice was very quiet. "Very even. I had practiced this evenness for 6 weeks, and it held now, right when I needed it. I'm not asking you to guess. I'm asking you to tell me what you actually know, because I'm going to find out regardless. And the conversation we're able to have will depend on whether you're honest with me from the beginning." He looked at me for a long moment. Something moved across his face that I hadn't seen there in a long time, something younger, something closer to the kid who used to sit at my kitchen table and admit when he'd done something wrong. It was buried under a lot of other things, but it was there. "Most of it," he said quietly. "There's maybe 60,000-70,000 left in that account. $330,000. Gone in 14 months. I held that number in my chest and breathed around it and didn't let my face change. "And the business operating account? We have about 2 months of runway at current expense levels. Maybe less if the logistic commitment comes due on schedule." "What about the commercial property lease income?" He frowned. "That goes into the operating account directly." Been covering He paused. Something shifted in his expression. "Wait, how do you know about the commercial property lease?" "Because it's my property," I said. "It's always been my property." "The lease is in my name, Nathan. It was never part of the business operating structure." Stared at me. "But the estate restructuring, the transfers we did." "You transferred what I authorized you to transfer," I said. "Which was not everything, not by a significant amount." The silence that followed that sentence was a specific kind of silence. The kind that comes when someone realizes the room they're standing in is much smaller than they thought, that the walls they believed were far away are actually right there, very close and closing in. "What are you saying?" Nathan said. I picked up my coffee cup, set it down again. "Do you remember about a year after your father died, you asked me why I was meeting with attorneys so often?" He nodded slowly. "You said it was estate planning." "It was, but not the estate planning you were helping me with. There was a separate structure, a separate attorney, separate documentation that I put in place, because grief has a way of making you honest about things you might otherwise avoid thinking about." I looked at him steadily. "Your father never protected what we built, Nathan. He trusted people who seemed trustworthy, and he didn't put safeguards in place. And when he died, I realized that I had spent 30 years building something that could be dismantled by someone I loved if I wasn't careful. So I was careful. Nathan's face had gone very still. What did you do? I placed the majority of the estate's real value into a protective trust structure that you don't have access to and couldn't access without my explicit authorization. The commercial property, the investment portfolio, certain business assets that were tied to my personal stake rather than the operational company. What you have been managing, what you were given access to, was a portion of the total. Enough to run the business properly, enough to live comfortably, not enough to liquidate the entire family legacy. Because I wanted to know if you could be trusted with responsibility before I trusted you with everything. I watched him absorb this, watched the sequence of it move through him, the initial incomprehension, then the slow, dawning calculation, then the full weight of what it meant. You set me a test, he said. His voice was flat. I set myself a protection, I said. The test was incidental. He sat back against the booth. He looked in that moment like a man who has been running very fast toward something and has just realized there was nothing there to run toward. The energy that had been carrying him, the forward momentum of spending and planning and expanding and living large on someone else's foundation, had nowhere to go. It just stopped. The logistics contract, he said slowly. The vendor payments, the operating account, that's all real. That's actually happening. Yes, I said, that's all real. And you could if you wanted, he stopped, rearranged. Is there money in the trust structures that could cover it? Yes, would you? I looked at my son across the diner table. I looked at him for a long time. I thought about the driveway, about my key that wouldn't turn, about $400,000 and a woman named Courtney and furniture deliveries, and 63 employees who had nothing to do with any of this and whose livelihoods were now being threatened by the carelessness of a man who had never once had to earn what he was spending. Not yet, I said. Not until we've talked about several things. What followed over the next hour was the most honest conversation I had ever had with my son in his adult life. That's a strange thing to say, that the most honest conversation came after the worst thing he'd ever done, but that's how it works, sometimes. People don't open up until they have no other choice. Nathan had no other choice. He told me about the logistics investment, a partnership with a man named Derek Souls, who had presented himself as a supply chain innovator with an established network of regional carriers. Nathan had committed $450,000 of business capital to the partnership based on a pitch presentation and 2 dinners and the kind of fast-talking confidence that impresses people who've never had to learn the hard way. That confidence is the cheapest thing in any room. Derek Souls, I said. Did Dennis know about this commitment? Nathan's eyes flicked down. No, I didn't want. I thought it was going to work out before anyone needed to know. Did you do any due diligence on him? References, company history, financials? A long pause. He had testimonials. I kept my face entirely neutral. Nathan, I spent 30 years checking references on people I'd worked with for a decade. Testimonials are not due diligence. I know that now. Did Mr. Souls deliver anything? The first 2 months he showed up, made some introductions, arranged some meetings. Then the meetings stopped producing, and he started being harder to reach, and 2 weeks ago he stopped returning calls entirely. I closed my eyes briefly, opened them. He took the money and disappeared. Nathan's face said everything. I'm still trying to. My attorney says there may be legal recourse, but that takes time, and in the meantime the vendor payments are backed up and the bank has flagged the account, and his voice dropped. I'm in real trouble, Mom. Yes, I said, you are. He looked up at me with something in his eyes I hadn't seen there since he was a teenager, something raw and undefended. Nathan had always been armored in public, even with me. He had inherited my ability to control what showed on his face, and he had used it in ways I never intended. But sitting across from me in Halloran's diner, with his coffee gone cold and his expensive jacket slightly wrinkled, and the full consequence of 14 months of bad decisions sitting on the table between us, the armor was gone. I'm sorry, he said. I know it doesn't fix anything. No, I said, it doesn't. What I did to you, locking you out, the house, he shook his head. I told myself it was practical, that it was about the estate structure and the tax implications, and I was actually helping you. I told myself that for weeks, and then I stopped being able to believe it. He looked at the table. Courtney left 3 weeks ago. She left when the money started, when I told her about the cash flow situation. He almost laughed, but it came out wrong. Turns out that was the only thing keeping her interested. I didn't say anything to that. I let it sit. The people I thought were my friends, Nathan continued, and his voice went quieter. They don't call anymore. They showed up when I had something to offer, and now I don't. And I sit in that house by myself at night, and I think about he stopped. I think about how I got here, how I became someone who would do this. That last sentence, how I became someone who would do this, was the most important thing Nathan Carter had said to me in years. Not because it let him off the hook. Nothing let him off the hook. But because it was the first time I had heard my son ask himself a real question instead of constructing an explanation. And real questions, in my experience, are where everything either breaks completely or begins to change. I sat with it for a moment. Then I said, I want to be very honest with you about something, Nathan. Not cruel, but honest, he nodded. You are 41 years old, and you have spent most of your adult life receiving things you didn't build. The company, the accounts, the house. Your father and I gave you all of it because we loved you and because we worked our whole lives telling ourselves we were building something for you. What we didn't do, what I didn't do, and I take responsibility for this, was make sure you understood what all of it cost. Not in dollars, in years, in decisions, in the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from building something from nothing, and knowing that if it fails, there's no one to catch you. Nathan was looking at me with the particular expression of someone hearing a truth they've been avoiding. Your father grew up like I did, I continued. He knew that cost because he'd lived it. By the time we had you, we'd already done the hard part, and we didn't want you to have to. We thought that was love. We thought we were giving you something. I stopped. We were giving you a life with no friction. And a life with no friction doesn't teach you what anything is actually worth. The silence between us held something different now. Not the charged defensive silence from earlier. Something more like space. Kind of space that opens up when two people stop protecting their positions and just sit with what's true. What happens now? Nathan asked. His voice was careful. Not demanding, just asking. That depends on you, I said. I'm not going to come in and rescue the business and hand everything back and pretend the last 6 weeks didn't happen. I'm not capable of that, and I wouldn't be doing you any favors if I were. I'm not asking for that. What are you asking for? He thought about it. Really thought, not the quick, practiced answer he'd have given a year ago. I don't know exactly. I think I'm asking for a chance to fix what I broke. I know I don't deserve it. I know I don't have any standing to ask. But I'm asking anyway. I looked at my son. Looked at the roses in my mind, the ones on the porch I'd planted 2 years ago, the ones I'd stood looking at on the driveway while my world restructured itself around a key that wouldn't turn. I thought about my mother and the coffee can and the $300, and the faith that exists in a gift given without conditions, and whether that kind of faith was wisdom or foolishness or something that existed in the complicated territory between the two. Thought about 63 employees who needed the business to survive. I thought about what Dennis had said about the fiduciary breach claim, which was already in motion, which Nathan didn't know about yet, and which gave me leverage I hadn't needed to use yet. I thought about the fact that my son, for the first time in perhaps ever, was sitting across from me with no armor on, asking a real question instead of running a strategy. Here's what I'm willing to do, I said. I'm going to stabilize the vendor accounts. I'm going to bring Dennis in to look at the Derek Souls situation and see what can be recovered legally. I'm going to make sure the 63 people who work for that company don't lose their jobs because of decisions they had nothing to do with. Nathan exhaled. Thank you, I'm not finished, I said. In exchange for that, you are going to provide Dennis with complete and total access to every financial record from the past 14 months. Every account, every transaction, every commitment you made. Not a curated version, everything. He nodded. And the house, I said. I want my house back, Nathan. Not eventually, not when it's convenient. I want the lock changed back, and I want my name on the deed where it belongs, and I want that done through proper legal channels within the next 2 weeks. I'll call my attorney today, he said. Call Dennis, I said. Your attorney hasn't been working in your best interest. Someone competent would have told you months ago that the management trustee structure wasn't going to hold up to a legal challenge, which I was already preparing. Dennis will handle the reversal correctly. Nathan stared at me. You had a legal challenge in motion? Since week 2, I said. Something crossed his face, not anger. Interestingly. Something closer to an involuntary respect. The kind you feel for an opponent, even when the opponent is your own mother. I didn't know you'd move that fast, he said quietly. You assumed I was waiting for you to come back to me, I said. You assumed that because that's how it had always worked. I would be hurt, and I would wait, and eventually you would come around, and I would absorb the damage, and we would move forward like it hadn't happened. That's the pattern we'd established, and you expected it to hold. It didn't, he said. No, I said. It didn't. I decided in my driveway that I was done with that pattern. Not done with you, but done with the version of our relationship where I absorbed consequences you created and called it love. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower. Is it possible? He stopped. Started again. Is there any version of this where we come out the other side of it still? He couldn't seem to find the word he wanted. Still what I said. Still family, he said. There it was. The thing underneath everything. The reason I'd sat by my phone at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night with my thumb over his number. The reason this was so much more complicated than any business dispute or legal challenge or financial recovery plan. Because at the bottom of all of it, beneath the $400,000 and the changed locks and the woman named Courtney and the failed logistics investment and the 63 employees and the vendor accounts, 60 days past due, at the bottom of all of it was a 68-year-old woman and the son she had loved since the moment she first held him, and whether anything salvageable remained between them. That's up to you, I said. It's always been up to you. I've been family this entire time, Nathan. I've been your mother since the day you were born, and I will be your mother until I die, and that doesn't change regardless of what you've done. But family is not just a feeling, it's a set of behaviors. It's what you do consistently over time. The feeling without the behavior is just a word. He nodded. His eyes were wet, and he blinked and looked away, and I let him. I don't know if I know how to be what you actually need me to be, he said when he looked back. I'm being honest. I've been the person I've been these past couple of years. I don't think that was who I actually am. But I also don't know exactly how it happened, how it got to this. That's what we'd have to figure out, I said. And that's not a quick conversation. That's not one lunch at a diner. That's a long time of doing things differently and seeing if it holds. I know, and Nathan, I waited until he was looking at me fully. The first time you make me a promise and break it. The first time I see you treating this as something to manage rather than something to actually change. I will not give you another conversation. I will complete the legal proceedings. I will protect what needs to be protected, and I will grieve the loss of my son and get on with my life. Do you understand that? Yes, he said, quietly. No negotiation in it. Good, I said. We sat for another few minutes. The diner moved around us, plates and conversations, and someone's child somewhere asking for more juice. Ordinary life, entirely indifferent to the fact that something significant had just happened at the back booth. Nathan paid for the coffee. It was a small thing, almost a meaningless thing. But I noticed the first in a very long time that my son had given something without expecting anything in return. Small, but it was there. I drove home to the apartment on Carmichael. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a while before going in. The sun was doing something complicated with the clouds over the building, breaking through in places and not others, so that parts of the brick were lit up and parts were in shadow. I watched it for a while. I thought about what I'd said about the protective trust, the second picture, the one Nathan hadn't known existed. Dennis had told me on Monday that the structure was solid and that my position was stronger than Nathan's by a significant margin, and that I had effectively all the leverage in any proceeding we wanted to pursue. What I hadn't told Dennis yet, what I was still deciding, sitting in that parking lot, watching the light move on the brick, was whether leverage was what I actually wanted to use. Whether winning the way I could win was the same thing as getting back what I'd lost. The business could be stabilized, the house could be returned, the legal challenge could be resolved. All of that was solvable with resources and the right people and time. What wasn't automatically solvable, what couldn't be fixed by any attorney or any trust structure or any amount of money, was the question of whether the son I had lunch with today was genuinely beginning to understand something, or whether he was doing what charming, intelligent people sometimes do when they're desperate, which is perform understanding convincingly enough to get what they need. I didn't know the answer to that yet. I wanted to believe one thing. I was too old and had seen too much to let wanting be enough. I was going to watch. I was going to require action over time. I was going to hold the boundary I had crossed across a diner table without flinching. And in the meantime, I was going to call Dennis and tell him to reach out to Nathan's attorney about the house. And I was going to call Helen and let her know that the vendor accounts were going to be brought current. And I was going to sit in my apartment that evening and eat something that wasn't soup from a can. And I was going to be the woman who had survived 6 weeks on an air mattress in a rented apartment and come out of it knowing exactly who she was. I got out of the car, went up the 3 flights, put my key in the lock of my own door, a lock that actually responded, on a door that was actually mine, and went inside. The narrow kitchen, the window with the brick wall view. The bed I had bought myself when I decided to stop sleeping on the floor of someone else's emergency plan. I stood there for a moment in the afternoon light and thought about my mother. About what she would have done, about what the woman who handed $300 across a kitchen table without hesitating would make of all this. She would have done what I was doing, I thought. She would have held the line. She would have required the truth. She would have left a door open because she understood that closing doors on the people you love is its own kind of irreversible damage, but she would have stood at that door with both hands on it and made very clear that walking through it required something real. I sat down at the small table by the window. I opened the folder of documentation Helen had sent. I began to work. Outside, the clouds shifted again, and the brick wall across from my window caught the light and held it. Dennis called me the morning after the Hallorans' lunch with the particular tone he used when things were moving in a direction he hadn't fully anticipated. Nathan's attorney contacted me at 7:30 this morning, he said. First thing, apparently Nathan called him last night. And he's cooperative. More cooperative than I expected, honestly. The attorney, his name is Belkin, Paul Belkin. Decent enough man told me Nathan wants to resolve the house situation without a court proceeding. He's prepared to sign the reversal documents this week. I stood at my kitchen window with my coffee. Brick wall across from the apartment was doing what it always did in morning light, catching it flat and returning nothing, just absorbing it. That's faster than I thought, I said. It's faster than I thought too, Dennis said. Tells me one of two things. Either the conversation you had yesterday actually moved something in him, or he's calculating that cooperating on the house buys him goodwill on the financial side, and he's playing a longer game. Which do you think it is? A pause. I think it might be both, Dennis said. I don't think those things are mutually exclusive. People can have genuine moments of clarity and also be practical about what cooperation gets them. That's not necessarily dishonesty. That's just being human. Fair enough, I said. What about the financial records? Belkin says Nathan will provide full access. He's having everything compiled now. I expect to receive the first batch by end of week. Another pause, heavier. Evelyn, I want to prepare you for what we're probably going to find. I'm prepared. It's going to be worse than the numbers he gave you at lunch. People in financial trouble almost always underestimate when they're confessing in person. There's a floor they can bring themselves to admit to in a face-to-face conversation, and then there's the actual floor, which is usually lower. I've seen this enough times to tell you the 60 to 70,000 he said was left in the joint account is probably optimistic. I held that. How optimistic? I'll know more by Friday. But I want you going into the next few weeks with realistic expectations rather than yesterday's numbers. Understood, I said. Dennis, regardless of what the records show, the vendor accounts need to be brought current first. Before anything else, those are people and companies that did their work and deserve to be paid. Agreed, he said. I'll advise drawing from the trust structure to cover those specifically. We can document it as a structured loan to the business that protects your position legally while solving the immediate problem. Good, let's do that. After I hung up, I sat for a while. The practical clarity of a conversation like that, the next step, the document, the legal mechanism. The Friday deadline was actually something I had come to find steadying over the past 6 weeks. When everything else was uncertain, the existence of a concrete next action was something you could hold on to. It gave shape to time that would otherwise just be waiting. What was harder to hold on to was everything underneath the practical layer. I had driven home from Hallorans the afternoon before telling myself I felt clear. And I did feel clear about the conditions, about the house, about the legal strategy, about what I was and wasn't willing to give. But clarity about conditions is different from clarity about feelings. And in the evening, after I'd called Dennis and called Helen and made myself a proper dinner for once, I sat at the small table by the window and felt something I didn't entirely have a name for. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. Forgiveness is a destination, not a single decision, and anyone who tells you otherwise has never had to actually do it. It wasn't relief exactly, though there was some of that, the relief of having said the things I needed to say without losing myself in the process. It wasn't grief, though grief was still present underneath everything the way it had been since Gerald died. The permanent background frequency of loss that you learn to live around rather than through. What it was, I think, was something closer to exhaustion. The deep kind. The kind that comes after you've been holding something very tightly for a very long time and you've finally been able to set it down for a moment. Not put it away, just set it down. And in the absence of the weight you've been carrying, your arms ache from having carried it. I missed my house. That was the simplest, most uncomplicated thing I felt. I missed my kitchen and my bedroom, and the specific way morning light moved through the front windows and the climbing roses on the porch that were dormant now, but would bloom again in May. I missed the 31 years of ordinary life embedded in those walls, Gerald's presence, still somehow in the study he'd used for 20 years, the marks on the kitchen doorframe where we'd tracked Nathan's height every birthday until he was 16. No, just it was embarrassing. I missed my own home with the raw, uncomplicated longing of someone who has had something taken that was simply and entirely theirs. Getting it back was not going to undo the fact that it had been taken. I knew that the house would be the same house, the rooms would be the same rooms. But I would know something about that house now that I hadn't known 6 weeks ago, which was that it was possible to be removed from it. That knowledge would always be there. The way scar tissue is always there, you stop noticing it most of the time, but it changes the texture of things permanently. I washed my dinner dishes and went to bed at 9:30 and slept 7 hours without waking, which was more than I'd managed on any single night since October. The financial records arrived in 3 batches over the following week, and Dennis had been right. The actual floor was significantly lower than what Nathan had described at lunch. I sat across from Dennis in his office on a Friday afternoon while he walked me through what the records showed, and I did what I had trained myself to do over 6 weeks of managing hard information. I listened, without letting my face change, and I asked clarifying questions, and I held the emotional response somewhere separate from the practical response, because mixing them up helps no one. The joint savings account had $41,000 remaining, not 60 to 70. The business operating account, after the vendor arrears were factored in, was effectively negative once the committed obligations were counted against the available balance. The logistics partnership with Derek Souls had consumed not $450,000, as Nathan had said at lunch, but closer to $520,000 when you included secondary payments that Nathan had apparently forgotten to mention, or hoped wouldn't surface, or had genuinely lost track of in the chaos of the preceding months. Derek Souls' legal situation was, according to Belkin, a probable fraud case. Souls appeared to have operated similar schemes with at least 2 other investors in different states, and there was a federal inquiry that Nathan's attorneys had only just discovered. Is there any realistic recovery on the Souls money? I asked. Dennis made the face he made when the answer was technically not. No, but practically close enough to know that the distinction barely mattered. In the long run, possibly some portion. These cases can take years, and recovery depends on whether there are any assets to recover. In the short run, nothing. You have to plan as if it's gone. All right, I said, then we plan as if it's gone. The vendor accounts can be resolved from the trust structure. I've drafted the loan documentation. I'd like you to review it this weekend. He slid a folder across the desk, and the house reversal paperwork is ready for signatures. Nathan signed his portion yesterday. Yours is on the top of that stack. I opened the folder, looked at the signature page. Nathan's signature was at the bottom, slightly cramped, the way his handwriting always got when he was under stress. I had known his handwriting since he was 6 years old, learning to write his name. That was the thing about being a mother that nobody warned you about adequately, how many small, specific ways you knew your child. The handwriting, the way he cleared his throat before saying something difficult, the particular silence he got when he was ashamed of something. I signed my name on the line above his. One more thing, Dennis said, and his voice shifted into the register he used for things that required careful handling. Nathan has asked through Belkin whether there's a possibility of him remaining involved with the business going forward. In some capacity. I looked up from the folder. What kind of capacity? That's deliberately left vague, I think. I believe Belkin is testing the temperature before they put anything specific on the table. I considered this for a moment. On one level, the question was simple. Nathan had mismanaged the business catastrophically. And the logical answer was no, not without significant conditions and oversight, and a structure that made a repetition of the past 14 months impossible. On another level, it was not simple at all, because Carter Textile Supply was not just an asset. It was 30 years of my life and Gerald's life, and the lives of 63 people who had built careers there, and its future was going to require someone to run it, and the candidates for that job were not immediately obvious. Tell Belkin that's a conversation for later, I said. Right now, Nathan's job is to give us complete access to everything and stay out of the way while we stabilize what he damaged. That conversation can happen in 3 months if the cooperation holds. Dennis nodded. That's a reasonable position. It's not a kind position, I said. But it's a fair one. Those aren't always different things. No, I agreed. They're not. I moved back into my house on a Thursday in late November, 37 days after the Halloran's lunch. It wasn't what I'd imagined in those weeks on Carmichael. I had built a version of it in my head, the key turning in the lock, the door opening, the particular smell of my own home wrapping around me, everything as I'd left it. Clean return, a restoration. What actually happened was more complicated and more human than that. The house had been occupied by people who were not me for nearly 2 months, and it showed. Not catastrophically, Nathan wasn't destructive, whatever else he was, but in the accumulated small ways that other people's presence leaves traces. The furniture in the living room was rearranged in a way that felt wrong, without my being able to immediately articulate why. There were marks on the kitchen counter from a coffee maker, placed in a spot I never would have chosen. In the guest bedroom, now empty, There was still the faint trace of a perfume I didn't recognize Courtney's. Presumably that lingered in the curtains even after the windows had been opened. The refrigerator had been cleaned out before I arrived, which I supposed was a form of consideration. The pantry was largely empty. I stood in the front hallway for a long moment. My tote bag on the floor next to me. The same tote bag I'd packed on that October evening when I'd told myself this was temporary, just for a month, just while Nathan organized everything. The entry was quiet. The house held that specific quality of emptiness that happens after people have left a space, not peaceful emptiness, but the vacancy of recent departure. Like a room that remembers being occupied. I walked through each room slowly, not inspecting exactly, just reacquainting the living room. The study with Gerald's bookshelves still intact, which surprised me and moved me more than I expected. Kitchen, the upstairs bedrooms. The bathroom where my blood pressure medication had been sitting on a shelf when I'd come back that October morning to find the lock changed. The shelf was bare now, the medication long since moved to Carmichael and back. The last place I went was the front porch. The climbing roses were bare-stemmed in November, same as they'd been on the morning I'd stood out here with my useless key. Just green-brown canes against the porch railing, dormant, waiting. Nothing beautiful about them in this season, but they were there. They had survived the weeks I'd been gone without anyone paying attention to them. The way plants that are well-established sometimes do, they don't need constant tending. They just need to be left alone to do what they already know how to do. I stood there for a while, not crying. I want to note that I had not cried through any of this, not on the driveway, not on Margaret's couch, not in the apartment on Carmichael. Not because I didn't feel things, I felt everything. But there was something in me that had decided early on that tears were for after. That during required something else. I stood on my porch in November and looked at the street and the neighbor's oak tree and the ordinary geography of a life I had built in this place, and I breathed. I was home. Nathan came to the house for the first time on a Saturday in early December. I had asked him to come, not because I thought the timing was ideal, not because I was ready for what a face-to-face in this specific space was going to feel like, but because certain things needed to happen in person, and certain conversations lose something essential when they're conducted through attorneys. He rang the doorbell. It took me a moment standing in my kitchen hearing that sound. He had grown up here. He had walked through that front door 10,000 times. He had his own key until 8 weeks ago, and now he was ringing the doorbell of the house he had locked me out of because there was no other appropriate thing to do. I let him in. He stood in the front hallway and looked around with an expression I couldn't immediately classify. Something layered discomfort and familiarity, and something that might have been remorse if remorse were something you could see plainly on a person's face, which usually it isn't. It looks like it always did, he said. I rearranged the living room back, I said. It's how I've always had it. He flinched slightly at that. Good, I thought, and then felt guilty for thinking it. And then decided I was allowed to feel both things at once, guilty for wanting him to flinch and also wanting him to flinch. That's just being human in a situation like this. We went to the kitchen. I made coffee, the automatic ritual of it, the gesture that says we are going to sit and talk like people do, regardless of the weight of what's between us. Nathan sat at the kitchen table, in the chair he'd sat in since childhood, and wrapped his hands around his mug, and I sat across from him. And for a moment, it was almost like it had always been. And then immediately it wasn't. Because everything that had happened was in the room with us. Dennis tells me you've been cooperative with the records, I said. Everything he's asked for, Nathan said. Whatever he needs. The vendor accounts are current as of yesterday. Frank Alderman's contract is being renegotiated. Dennis has someone working on the logistics side to replace what Souls was supposed to provide. It's going to cost more in the short term, but the contract terms will be realistic. I know, Belkin briefed me. He looked up. How bad is it? Overall, the business, how bad is it in your assessment? I considered how to answer this. The honest answer was bad but not fatal. The honest answer was that 30 years of solid relationships and genuine market presence is a foundation that can survive 14 months of mismanagement if you catch it in time and act quickly, and people believe the ship is being righted. Helen had told me last week that morale in the company was cautious but not collapsed. People knew something had gone wrong, but they also knew I was back involved. And that information had moved through the company the way information always moves through companies of that size, which is to say immediately and entirely. It's recoverable, I said. It's going to take 12 to 18 months of careful management and no more surprises. But the core of it is still sound. The relationships are still there. Nathan nodded. Because of what you built, he said. Not taking credit, just stating it. Because of what your father and I built, I said. Over 30 years, that kind of foundation doesn't disappear in 14 months. It gets damaged, but it doesn't disappear. He was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking a lot about what you said at the diner. About the friction thing. About how I didn't grow up understanding what things cost. And I think you're right. I think I knew the number attached to things, but I didn't know the weight of them. I could look at a balance sheet and tell you what the company was worth, but I didn't. He paused, searching for the right words and not finding them easily, which was itself different from how Nathan usually talked. Nathan usually found words easily. I didn't feel it. Cost of it, the years in it. No, I said, you didn't. I'm not sure I know how to learn that at 41, he said. I'm not sure it's the kind of thing you can learn if you didn't grow up with it. I don't know either, I said honestly, but I think the first step is admitting you don't know the weight of something before you pick it up. That's what your father and I never did. We never made you estimate the weight before we handed things to you. We just handed them over and expected that you'd figure it out. You couldn't have known he stopped. I don't want to make excuses. Then don't, I said. I'm not looking for explanations right now. I'm looking at what comes next. Nathan put his coffee cup down. I've been working, he said. I know that probably sounds like I know it's not impressive compared to what I've taken. But I've been doing consulting work this past month. A former classmate runs a mid-sized distribution company, and he needed some operational analysis done. Belkin connected us. It's not it doesn't pay what I was drawing from the business, but I'm working. On something I earned the opportunity for. I looked at him steadily. How is it humbling, he said, in ways I didn't expect. Sitting across from someone who actually needs the work done, and knowing that my value in that room is entirely what I know and what I can deliver, not anything my name attached to. He shook his head. Different, yes, I said, it is. I paid the first vendor I personally owed money to this week, he said. A caterer I'd hired them for an event at the house back in October, and the check bounced when the accounts got frozen. I tracked down the owner and I paid her in full, plus a late fee I added myself because it was the right thing to do. It was a small thing, a few $100s to a caterer against the backdrop of hundreds of thousands in damage. But I had told Nathan at Halloran's that I was going to watch his actions over time, not his promises, and an action had just been placed on the table. Small, but placed there deliberately. That counted for something. Good, I said. I have a list, he said, of people I personally owe apologies or money to that are separate from the business accounts. People I hired or made commitments to while I was during that period. I'm working through the list. How long is the list? He almost smiled ruefully. Longer than I'd like. Work through it anyway, I said. Don't rush it to show me progress. Do it because it's what a person does when they've caused harm. The difference between doing it to demonstrate something and doing it because it's right people can tell, eventually. He nodded. I know, we sat for a while. The kitchen was warm, and the December light was flat and gray through the windows, the kind of light that makes everything look still. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet in the way of Saturday mornings. Car passed. Somewhere down the street, someone was running a leaf blower, even though most of the leaves were long gone. Can I ask you something? Nathan said, you can ask. Did you when you set up the trust structure? The second picture you called it. Did you do that because you suspected me specifically, or was it just protection in general? I thought about this. I owed him an honest answer, and the honest answer was complicated. It was both, I said finally. After your father died, I looked at the estate, and I thought anyone could do damage here if they had access, and were careless or deliberate about it. I wasn't specifically thinking of you, but I stopped. I had noticed things. The way you talked about the accounts. Questions you asked about the commercial property. The way you said or when you meant yours. I noticed those things and I told myself it was just Nathan, being comfortable, not thinking about word choice. But some part of me filed them away. So you were watching me even then, he said. Not accusatory. I was watching the situation, I said. There's a difference. I didn't want to believe that my son needed to be watched. But I also wasn't going to leave everything exposed because I didn't want to believe it. That's very you, he said, quietly. And there was something in the way he said it, not sarcastic, not resentful, that was almost, at a distance, like admiration. Like he was seeing something he should have seen sooner. Nathan left around 2 o'clock. We didn't hug at the door. That felt like too much, too fast. A gesture that would have performed reconciliation without it actually existing yet. He put on his coat and picked up his keys and stood for a moment in the front hallway, and I stood a few feet away, and we looked at each other. Thank you for letting me come, he said. Thank you for coming, I said. He left. I closed the door and stood in the hallway for a moment. The house was quiet again. Mine again. But different from before. I couldn't pretend it wasn't different. Couldn't pretend that everything was simply restored to what it had been. The house was the same 4 walls and the same rooms and the same climbing roses outside. But I was not the same person who had lived in it before October, and Nathan was not the same son who had sat at my kitchen table before Gerald died. And whatever this was going to be going forward, it was going to be built on that reality, rather than on the comfortable fictions we'd both been living inside. That was okay. I had decided it was okay, not ideal. Not what I would have chosen, but okay. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. I want to be honest about that because stories tend toward the dramatic in real life, even hard real life, tends toward the ordinary. What happened after Nathan's December visit was largely administrative and incremental, and slow the careful, unglamorous work of repair. Dennis completed the financial records review in mid-December and confirmed the numbers I'd already been holding in my head. He filed the breach of fiduciary duty documentation not to pursue a legal proceeding against Nathan. I had decided by then that I didn't want that, not because Nathan deserved to be spared it, but because the business needed stability, and a proceeding would create a turbulence that the company's employees couldn't afford but to establish a formal legal record of what had occurred. Protection, a document that existed in case the situation ever needed to be revisited. Nathan had been informed this was happening. Belkin had advised him. He had not objected. I thought about that Nathan not objecting to the creation of a legal record of his own misconduct, and I decided it was another small action placed on the table. Not proof of transformation, not evidence that the work was done, but evidence that he was doing something different than performing innocence. I went back to the company in January. Not as the day-to-day operator, I had no interest in going back to 12-hour days at 68 years old, but in an advisory capacity that Dennis helped me formalize into a proper structure. The operating authority would be managed by a small executive team that Helen had helped me identify, people who had been doing the substantive work for years and knew the company's actual mechanics better than Nathan ever had. I would hold strategic oversight. The trust structure remained fully in place. Helen cried when I told her about the new structure. Just briefly, she was not a crier by nature, and then she collected herself and said, "I'm sorry, that's unprofessional." And I told her it was entirely professional to cry when something you've been worried about for 14 months is resolved. Frank Alderman took me to lunch and said he was glad to have me back in the picture and that the renegotiated contract terms were ones he could actually work with. He didn't say anything bad about Nathan, which I respected. He just talked about the work, about what the company could do, and what he needed from it. And we spent 90 minutes talking about the future rather than the past. That, I discovered, was a choice you had to make consciously and repeatedly. Talk about the future rather than the past. Take stock of what remained rather than cataloging only what was lost. It didn't come naturally. Some mornings I woke up, and the first thing in my mind was the driveway and the key that wouldn't turn. And I had to actively choose to redirect to the vendor contracts being settled, to Helen's competent hands on the accounts payable, to the roses that would come back in May. Nathan called me twice a week. That was what I had asked for, not long calls, not processing sessions, just regular contact so that I could hear how he was and he could know I was here. The calls were sometimes awkward, in the way of relationships that are being rebuilt, where you haven't yet found the new rhythm and the old rhythm no longer fits. We talked about the consulting work, which was going better. We talked about the business carefully. We talked occasionally about Gerald. Nathan had started doing that, bringing his father up, as if he was trying to reintegrate something he'd been avoiding. One evening in late January, he called and said, "I've been thinking about something you said, about not handing things to me to carry without making me estimate the weight first. What about it? I think I've been doing that to myself my whole life. Not just with what you gave me. With everything, I pick things up and I assume I can handle them, and then I find out I was wrong, but by then there's damage." A pause. I don't know how to change that exactly, but I've been thinking about it. Thinking about it is the beginning, I said. Is it enough? No, I said, but it's the beginning. He was quiet for a moment. I looked at the list this week, he said. The one I told you about. The people I owe, I've resolved about half of them. The other half? Working on it. Some of them are more complicated than just money. Some of them are I said things. During that period. I was a different version of myself, and I said things to people who didn't deserve it. And those ones are harder. They're supposed to be harder, I said. Money is easy to hand over. Sitting across from someone and admitting you behaved badly, that costs something different. Yeah, he said, it does. We stayed on the phone for a while after that without talking much. Just the ambient sound of two people existing on either end of a line. It was not the closeness we'd had when he was young, not that specific tenderness that existed between us before Gerald died, and Nathan changed in ways I'd been slow to name. I didn't know if we'd get back to something like that. I didn't know if the version of our relationship that might exist going forward would be better or worse or simply different from everything that had come before. What I knew was that it was real. For the first time in years, what was happening between my son and me was real, not performed, not managed, not built on a foundation of me absorbing things I shouldn't have absorbed and him taking things that weren't his to take. Real, difficult, and uncertain, and nowhere near finished, but real. That was not nothing. In fact, standing in my kitchen in late January with the phone in my hand and the winter light gray through the window and the climbing roses outside dormant but rooted, waiting for whatever came next, it felt like something considerable. I had told Nathan at the diner that family was a set of behaviors, not just a feeling. I believed that. I still believed it. But I was beginning to think that the feeling, when it was real and when it was earned, was not small either. That the love that remained between a parent and a child, after everything that had been done and survived and rebuilt from that, it had weight. Real weight. The kind you don't know how to estimate until you've tried to carry it through the worst version of things and found that it's still there. Still there. I said goodnight to my son and hung up the phone. I stood at my kitchen window for a while. Outside, the street was quiet and cold, and the neighbor's oak tree was bare against the winter sky, same as it always was in January. In 4 months, the roses would come back. I was already looking forward to it. The roses came back in May. I was standing at the kitchen window with my morning coffee when I noticed them, not the full bloom, not yet, but the first tight bud showing pink along the canes, that tentative early color that always appeared before the real flowering began. I stood there longer than I needed to, holding my mug with both hands, looking at those buds through the glass, and something moved through me that I didn't try to name right away. I just let it move. 7 months. That was how long it had been since the morning I'd stood on that porch with my canvas bag and my useless key and made myself a promise on the driveway. 7 months since I had driven away from my own house, not knowing with any certainty whether I would ever come back to it, whether the thing I had built over 31 years would survive what my son had decided to do with it, whether the woman who had planted those roses 4 decades ago still had enough of herself left to do what needed to be done. 7 months. And here I was in my kitchen, watching my roses come back. I want to tell you that everything was resolved cleanly by then. I want to tell you that the story had wrapped itself up the way stories are supposed to, all the loose ends tied, all the damage repaired, all the relationships restored to something better than what they'd been before. That's the version I might have told you 6 months earlier, when I was still in the apartment on Carmichael, and the future was entirely theoretical, and I could construct it however I needed to in order to get through the day. But I'm 69 years old now, and I have earned the right to tell you the true version instead. The true version is that some things resolved and some things didn't, and some things resolved in ways I didn't expect, and some things that I thought would heal are still healing, slowly, with the particular patience that healing actually requires, rather than the patience we imagine it requires when we haven't yet had to practice it. Let me tell you what was true by May. Carter Textile Supply was still standing. That was the first and most important thing. Helen had sent me a first quarter report in April that I read at my kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, and when I finished reading it, I sat for a while with the papers in my hand and thought about Gerald, about the machine shop his father worked in, about my mother's coffee can, about what it means to build something from nothing and have it still be there when you come back to it after the worst thing has happened. The numbers were not triumphant. They were not the numbers of a company that had thrived. They were the numbers of a company that had survived, which is a different thing and a harder thing in some ways, because surviving requires you to look honestly at how far down you went and measure the distance back up still to climb. The vendor accounts were current. The Logan contract, Frank Alderman's distribution deal, renegotiated in February with logistics terms that were actually achievable, was performing on schedule. 2 of the 3 regional partners had renewed their commitments after conversations with me in which I did not pretend the past 14 months hadn't happened, but was honest about what I had put in place to prevent it from happening again. The 3rd partner, a woman named Gloria Reyes, who ran a mid-sized textile manufacturing operation in the southern part of the state, had not renewed. She had been polite about it. Gloria was always polite, but she had told me in January that the disruption to their supply schedule during Nathan's tenure had cost her company more than she could easily absorb, and that she needed to see a longer track record of stability before she could recommend reinstating the partnership to her board. I thanked her for her honesty. I told her I understood. I told her the door was open when she was ready. That was a real loss. I want to name it as a loss because it was one, and because the temptation when you're telling a story about resilience is to minimize the losses and emphasize the recoveries, and that's dishonest. Gloria Reyes was a good partner, and we lost her because my son was careless with something that wasn't his to be careless with. The business recovered, but the Gloria Reyes partnership did not, and both of those things are true simultaneously. Helen managed the day-to-day operations with a quiet efficiency that made me aware of how much she had always been doing underneath the titles that other people held. She had promoted 2 people from within a man named James, who had been running inventory management for 6 years, and who turned out to have a gift for operational logistics that nobody had bothered to look for before, and a younger woman named Serena, who had joined the company 4 years ago in an entry-level accounts role, and who had been watching everything from there with the sharp, patient attention of someone waiting for the right moment. Between the 3 of them, the company's daily operations were in better hands than they'd been in years. Came in twice a week, I reviewed strategic decisions. I attended the important client meetings, and then I went home because I had spent 40 years of my life inside that company, and I had earned the right to be 69 and also have afternoons. That was a new thing, afternoons. Having them. Using them for something other than work. The Derek Souls situation resolved in February in the way that Dennis had predicted it probably wouldn't, with partial recovery. A federal investigation into Solis' operations across multiple states had identified him in December. He'd been arrested in January at an airport in Atlanta attempting to board a flight with a one-way ticket and 3 carry-on bags. The recovery of assets was still ongoing as of spring. But the investigators had located approximately 40% of the funds he'd taken from various investors. And Nathan, because Dennis had moved quickly and filed the proper documentation before most of the other victims had retained. Attorneys was positioned near the front of the creditor line. It wasn't the $520,000. It was never going to be the $520,000. But it was something, and in the context of a situation where I had planned for nothing, something was better than I'd let myself hope for. Nathan called me the evening after the arrest was reported. I was in the living room reading, and when I saw his name on the phone, I picked up and he said, without preamble, "They got him." "I know," I said. "Dennis called me earlier, Mom." His voice was strange. I keep thinking about how I would have felt 6 months ago if this had happened. I would have thought it solved things. I would have thought the money coming back was the whole answer. And now I know it doesn't fix what I did," he said. "Whatever comes back from Souls, that's not the point. I mean, it's practical. It helps. But it's not, it doesn't fix the actual thing." I sat with that for a moment. "No," I said, "it doesn't. I just wanted you to know that I know that," he said. "That's all." We talked for a while after, about nothing important, about the recovery process and what Dennis expected the timeline to look like. But what I held on to from that conversation wasn't any of the practical information. It was the moment before, when my son had called to tell me that the money wasn't the point. That was a version of Nathan Carter I had not heard before October, and I was aware enough to know that hearing it once didn't mean anything was permanently changed, but I was also honest enough to acknowledge that it was something. I want to talk about Courtney for a moment, because she keeps coming up in my thoughts even though she was in my life for the length of a phone call. Because she represents something that I think needs to be said plainly. I don't know Courtney. I never met her. I know she had dark hair, and that she drove a car I didn't recognize, and that she left Nathan 3 weeks into his financial crisis, with a speed that suggested her interest in him had always been specifically calibrated to what he could provide. I know that her departure hurt him, not because he said so directly, but because of the particular flatness in his voice during those December conversations when I asked how he was doing, the way certain subjects sat heavy in him. Here is what I want to say about Courtney. She is not a villain in this story. I know that's not what you expect me to say. The easy version of this story has her as the predatory woman who took advantage of my son and contributed to his downfall. But I've been thinking about this for 7 months, and I don't believe that's true, and I don't believe it's fair. Courtney saw a man with money and a nice house and an easy manner, and she was interested in those things. When those things went away, she left. That is not admirable behavior, but it is not predatory either. It is simply what happens when a relationship is built on what someone has rather than who they are. Nathan built that relationship on what he had on access to my home, my money, a lifestyle he hadn't earned, and when the foundation of it turned out to be borrowed, the structure collapsed. That's not Courtney's doing. That's the inevitable consequence of building on something that doesn't belong to you. Nathan had done to Courtney, in a way, what the Courtneys of the world do to the people they attach themselves to. He had presented a version of himself that was contingent on access to other people's resources. And when those resources were withdrawn, he had nothing solid to offer. I'm not sure he saw that parallel. I wasn't sure it was my job to point it out. What I did say to him, in a phone call in March, was this: the next person you're in a relationship with, I want you to meet them when you have nothing impressive to offer. When you're working and paying your debts and living in an apartment you can actually afford. Let them see that version of you first. He was quiet for a moment. That's not a very romantic approach, he said. No, I said. But it's a reliable one. I'm going to tell you about the hardest day of these 7 months, because it happened in March, and I haven't told anyone else about it, and because I think it's the truest thing in this whole story. It was a Tuesday. Nathan had asked if he could come for dinner, not a formal occasion. Just dinner, the first time I'd had him at the house for a meal since December. I had said yes. I'd made the pot roast that Gerald used to request for his birthday, partly because it's what I knew how to make without thinking too hard, and partly because, I'll admit it, I wanted to see how it felt to cook for my son in my own kitchen again. He came at 6. He was on time, which was new. Nathan had always been constitutionally late for everything in his life, a habit that used to drive me quietly insane and that I had long since stopped mentioning. He was on time, and he had brought flowers, which he handed me at the door with a slightly awkward formality, like someone following instructions about the right thing to do rather than doing it naturally. We ate dinner. The conversation was careful in the way our conversations still were not strained, but deliberate, each of us navigating around the things that could still detonate without adequate warning. We talked about James and Serena and Helen. We talked about the Derek Souls case timeline. We talked about the consulting work Nathan was still doing, which had expanded to a second client and was now paying him a reasonable monthly income that he was living within. Actually within, for perhaps the first time in his adult life. After dinner, he helped me clear the table. That surprised me. He had never in his adult years helped clear a table without being asked, and he wasn't asked now. He just picked up the plates and carried them to the kitchen and stood at the sink running hot water. We did the dishes together. My kitchen is small enough that 2 people at the sink are shoulder to shoulder, and we stood there in that proximity, my son and I, after everything, and washed the dinner dishes the way people do in ordinary life. And I was thinking about nothing in particular when Nathan said, without looking at me, I dream about it sometimes. What I did. I wake up, and for a second I don't know if it was real. Kept washing, and then you remember it was. And then I remember it was, he said. And I lie there for a while, and I think about you on that driveway. I know you were there. You told me you stood there for a while. I think about what your face must have looked like. I handed him a dish to dry. He took it. I don't know what my face looked like, I said honestly. I wasn't watching myself. Were you scared? I thought about this. No, I said slowly. I was many things betrayed. Furious. Sad in a way I didn't have words for, but not scared. I paused. I think I stopped being scared of hard things a long time ago. Your father's death took that option away from me. When the worst thing happens, the other things stop being as frightening. Nathan was quiet for a moment, drying the dish slowly. I was scared, he said, through all of it, that whole period. I was terrified the whole time. That surprised me. Of what? Of it not being enough, he said, the money, the house, the people around me. I kept thinking I need more. I need to move faster. I need to make this bigger. Because if I stop and look at it too closely, I'm going to see that it's not actually mine, and it's not actually real, and there's nothing underneath it. He set the dish down. The fear was always there. I just turned it into motion so I didn't have to feel it. I stopped washing. I stood at the sink, and I looked at my son, really looked at him, the way I had looked at him when they first put him in my arms, just trying to see what was actually there. He was 41 years old, and he was tired, and there were lines in his face that hadn't been there a year ago, and he was standing in my kitchen, holding a dish towel and telling me something true. Something cracked open in me then, not dramatically, not like in movies, where the music swells and someone collapses. Just quietly, a scene gave way. All those months of being controlled and measured, and strategic and clear, all those weeks of holding everything tightly enough that I could function, something in me just opened up quietly while I was standing at my kitchen sink. I know you were scared, I said. My voice was different than I'd intended. I was scared of you, of what you'd become, of the possibility that I had something to do with making you that way. Nathan looked at me. Mom, I'm not asking you to tell me I didn't, I said. I might have. I've thought about it enough to know I can't be entirely sure. What I gave you, how I gave it, the fact that your father and I never made you sit with discomfort long enough to learn what it taught, those things shaped you, Nathan. I'm not going to stand here and take no responsibility for that. He set the dish towel down on the counter. You didn't make me lock you out of your own house, he said quietly. That was mine. That decision was mine. Yes, I said. It was. I'm saying the road that led you to being able to make that decision, that road had construction from more than one person. We stood there in the kitchen for a while. Neither of us spoke. Outside, the March evening was doing what March evenings do, undecided between winter and something warmer. The light changing in that tentative way that still isn't quite spring, but isn't entirely winter anymore. Then Nathan put his arms around me. He hadn't hugged me since before Gerald died. Not really. There had been the obligatory holiday embraces, the formal greetings and goodbyes of adults who have drifted into performing family rather than being it. But this was different. This was the hug of a person who needed to hold on to something and had finally run out of reasons not to admit it. I held my son in my kitchen, and I felt 69 years of everything love and fury and grief and relief and all the complicated texture of being a parent, which nobody tells you is the most unreasonable, irrational, inescapable thing you will ever do with your life. You love them before they're born. You love them when they fail. You love them, apparently, even when they change the locks on your door, and the love doesn't go away. It just gets buried under the necessary task of protecting yourself. And when the protection lifts for a moment, there it is. Still there, inconvenient and unconditional and entirely human. I didn't cry then either, but it was close. In April, I made a decision that Dennis told me was unnecessary from a legal standpoint, but that I had decided was necessary from every other standpoint. I established a formal charter for the Carter Family Trust, the protective structure I had put in place after Gerald died, the second picture that Nathan hadn't known about. The charter was a document that outlined the purpose, structure, and governing principles of the trust in plain language, not legal language. It described what the trust contained, what it was for, and most importantly, what conditions would need to be met for any significant disbursement or structural change. I wrote it myself. Dennis reviewed it and cleaned up the legal language, but the substance was mine. It took me 3 evenings at the kitchen table and 2 complete drafts that I threw away before I got the third one right. The charter said, in its plainest section, the assets held within this trust represent the accumulated labor, sacrifice, and judgment of 2 people across 30 years of work. They are not an inheritance to be spent. They are a foundation to be maintained. Any person seeking access to or influence over these assets must demonstrate, through sustained and documented action over time, that they understand the difference between those 2 things. I gave Nathan a copy. I didn't present it formally. I didn't make a ceremony of it. I put it in an envelope and left it on the kitchen table the next time he came for dinner and told him it was there and that he should read it when he had time. He called me 2 days later. I read it, he said. And a pause. It's fair, he said. It's exactly fair. Another pause. There's a line in there. They must understand the difference between a foundation and an inheritance. I've been thinking about that for 2 days. What have you been thinking? That I never did understand that, he said. Not really. I think I thought I was going to inherit something, not maintain something. Those are completely different relationships to have with a thing. Yes, I said. They are. I want to learn the second one, he said. I'm not saying I know how yet, but I want to. I had told Nathan at Halloran's Diner back in November that I was going to watch his actions over time and not his promises. I had meant that, and I still meant it. But I had also come to believe, over these months, that the desire to do something differently genuinely felt, genuinely expressed was not nothing. It wasn't proof, it wasn't sufficient, but it was the necessary beginning without which nothing else was possible. Then start learning, I said. The question I get asked most often by Margaret, by Helen, by Robert O.C., by the few friends I'd told the full story to is some version of, do you trust him now? And I have thought about that question carefully, because it deserves a careful answer. Trust, I have decided, is not a single thing. It's not a door that's either open or closed. It's more like the roses on my porch. It grows in conditions, at its own pace, and you can't force it to bloom before it's ready. And if you cut it back too severely, it takes longer to come back. And sometimes after a hard winter, you genuinely don't know until spring whether it survived. I trust Nathan with some things. I trust that he understands now, in a way he didn't before, that the business represents people's livelihoods and not a personal resource. I trust that he is genuinely working through the list of people he owes. He told me in April that he had completed it. And I believe him, partly because 3 of the people on that list contacted me independently to tell me he had. I trust that the consulting work is real and that he's paying his own rent, and that the person who called me to say the Derek Solzels money wasn't the point, was telling me the truth in that moment. I do not trust that this is permanent. I do not trust that the changes are deep enough yet to hold under serious pressure. I do not trust that I have seen all of who Nathan is or all of who he's capable of being, in either direction. That kind of trust, the kind that's been tested and held and tested again, takes years to build, and we have had months. I am watching. I will continue to watch, and if what I see over time is consistent with what I've seen since December, then perhaps the word trust will mean something fuller by the time I'm 70. Perhaps I'm not going to promise myself a particular outcome. I've learned at 69 that promising yourself outcomes is how you end up blindsided when life delivers something different. Better to stay clear about what's actually in front of you and navigate that honestly. What I will tell you what I know to be true right now in May, standing at my kitchen window watching the first buds on the climbing roses, is that I am not the same woman I was in October. And I mean that in both directions. I am not the woman who handed her son the keys to everything she'd built because she was tired and grieving and wanted to believe that love was enough of a reason to trust someone. But I am also not the woman who stood on a driveway, telling herself she would never let anyone close enough to hurt her again. Which is the other tempting story to tell yourself after something like this, the one where you seal yourself up and call it strength. Neither of those women is who I want to be. Neither of them is who I am now. What I am now is someone who knows the precise weight of what she's built. Not in dollars, not even primarily in dollars, but in years. In decisions. In the specific kind of competence that comes from being wrong about things and surviving being wrong and trying again anyway. I know what I built because I was there for every piece of it. And I know what it's worth because I have now watched what happens when someone treats it as less than it's worth. And I know what I'm capable of because I was tested in a way I wouldn't have chosen, and I came through it. That knowledge is mine. No one can take it. The last thing I want to tell you is about a morning in late May, about 3 weeks after the roses came fully into bloom. I was on the front porch with my coffee, a habit I'd gotten back into. The morning porch coffee that I'd had for years and lost, during the Carmichael months and reclaimed when I came home. The roses were fully open by then, that soft pink I'd chosen 42 years ago, because I wanted something that looked like it was trying without trying too hard. The street was quiet. A bird was doing something complicated in the oak tree 2 doors down. The kind of morning that doesn't ask anything of you. Nathan pulled up to the curb at 8:15. I hadn't known he was coming. He'd called the night before and asked if he could stop by in the morning, said he said something he wanted to show me, and I'd said yes without asking what it was. I watched him get out of the car. His car now, not mine, not funded by anything taken a used Honda he'd bought in February that he'd told me, with a rueful self-awareness that was new and good on him, had more miles on it than he was entirely comfortable admitting. He came up the porch steps and stopped when he saw the roses. I watched him look at them. He stood there for a moment, just looking, and I saw something move across his face, something I didn't try to interpret or categorize. I just let it be there. They came back, he said. They always come back, I said. They're well established. They just need to be left alone to do what they know how to do. He looked at me then. Something in that sentence had landed, I could tell. He didn't comment on it. He just sat down in the other porch chair, the one Gerald used to use on Saturday mornings, and reached into the bag he'd brought with him. I finished this last night, he said, and handed me a folder. I opened it. Inside was a document not legal, not financial. Personal document, handwritten first by the looks of the margins and the corrections, then typed up. Top it said, "What I'm learning about the company." I looked at him. He was looking at the roses. "I've been writing it since January," he said. "Not to show you I didn't write it for you. I wrote it because Dennis told me once that the way to understand what something costs is to write down every step of how it got there. So I've been talking to Helen and to Frank and to some of the people who've been at the company a long time, and I've been writing down what they tell me. What went into building the vendor relationships? What your father did in the first decade when the company was small enough that one bad month could have ended it. What you did in the years after the financial crisis when everyone was contracting and you held on and didn't lay anyone off, even when it would have been the practical choice. I was looking at the document in my hands. The pages were dense, specific, not a summary, a record. I wanted to understand the weight of it, Nathan said quietly, before I asked to be trusted with any of it again. I sat with that for a moment. The morning was doing what late May mornings do, warming slowly. The light getting cleaner, the bird in the oak tree still working through its complicated agenda. "Are you going to ask," I said, "to be trusted with any of it again?" He turned to look at me. "Not yet," he said. "I don't think I'm ready yet. But I wanted you to know I'm trying to get ready. The right way this time." I looked at my son, 41 years old, sitting in his father's chair on my porch, having spent 4 months writing down the history of a company in order to understand what it cost before he asked to touch it again. Not there yet, aware that he wasn't there yet, trying anyway. I thought about my mother, about the coffee can, about what it means to give something to someone when you believe in the person more than the outcome is guaranteed, about the difference between blind faith and informed faith, between handing something over because you can't bear to withhold it and handing something over because you have looked clearly at the person in front of you and decided the evidence taken together is sufficient. I thought about Gerald, who had never adequately protected what he'd built because he believed the people he loved would automatically treat it well. I had spent 30 years watching that assumption, and 30 months after his death learning from what it cost. I was not going to make Gerald's mistake. I was also not going to make the opposite mistake, the one where fear of being hurt again becomes its own kind of damage, where you seal everything away so tightly that nothing and no one can reach it, and you call that wisdom when it's actually just loneliness with better paperwork. Keep writing, I said. When you're done, I want to read all of it. Nathan nodded. Something in his face relaxed, not relief exactly, but something adjacent to it. The particular release of someone who has been holding their breath without realizing it. We sat on the porch for a while after that. I finished my coffee. Nathan had brought his own in a travel mug and he drank it slowly. We didn't talk much, the morning didn't require it. A neighbor walked a dog past the house and lifted a hand in greeting, and I lifted mine back. The bird in the oak tree reached some kind of resolution and went quiet. The roses moved slightly in the light morning air. That soft early pink, the color I had chosen because I wanted something that looked like it was trying without trying too hard. 42 years on the same porch railing, coming back every May regardless of what the winter had been. Not because anyone forced them to, not because conditions were always ideal, because they were well established and they knew what they were, and knowing what you are turns out to be the thing that gets you through the winters. I have been asked, in these 7 months, whether I regret any of it, whether I wish I had acted sooner, protected more, trusted less, seen what was coming before it arrived. And my honest answer is I regret the pain, I regret the driveway. I regret the $41,000 that wasn't 65, and the Gloria Reyes partnership that probably isn't coming back, and the specific loneliness of lying on an air mattress in a rented apartment, wondering whether the thing you spent your life building was going to survive what your own child did to it. I regret those things, I carry them. But I have come to believe, and this took longer to believe than I expected, and some mornings I still have to choose to believe it rather than it coming naturally, that the 7 months did something that the preceding years hadn't. They showed me who I actually was. Not the woman in the story I'd been telling myself, the one where I was the steady center of a family I'd successfully built and a business I'd competently handed on. The real woman. The one who could sleep on an air mattress and rebuild from a canvas tote bag. The one who called Dennis Hargrove on a Saturday morning and Patricia Chen about a month-to-month lease and Robert Ossie about the portfolio and had all 3 conversations before noon. The one who sat across from her son at a diner and said the true things clearly and held the boundary without cruelty and meant it. I had spent 68 years building things for other people. Building the company for Nathan. Building the home for Gerald. Building the security and the comfort and the continuity that I thought was what love looked like when you expressed it in actions rather than words. And all of that was real. I'm not undoing it, not dismissing it. It was love, it just wasn't complete. The part that was missing was this, building something for yourself. Knowing what you're worth, not because someone else values you, but because you have looked at your own life clearly and taken honest stock of what you made and what you survived and what you're still capable of at 69 years. Old with a cup of coffee on your own porch in May. I know what I'm worth now. Not what my estate is worth, not the trust structure, not the investment portfolio, not the commercial property lease income. What I am worth. The distinction matters. It matters more than I knew it did when I was younger and measuring everything by what I was building, rather than who I was becoming in the process of building it. Here's what I want to say to you. If you are someone sitting somewhere listening to this story, because something in it sounded familiar, because you have loved someone who took more than you offered, or you have worked your whole life and wondered whether you protected it correctly, or you have stood in a driveway or a hospital hallway or a lawyer's office and felt the floor come out from under something you believed was solid, you are allowed to protect yourself, not instead of loving people alongside it. Protecting yourself is not a betrayal of the people you love. It is the condition that makes it possible to keep loving them without destroying yourself in the process. The most important boundary you will ever draw is not the one between you and a stranger. It is the one between you and the people who believe, because of how much you love them, that you have no limits. You have limits, name them, hold them, not with cruelty, with clarity. There is a difference, and the difference matters enormously. And if someone you love has taken something from you, your money, your dignity, your sense of safety in your own home, you are not obligated to absorb it and call it love. You are not obligated to wait for them to come back to you on their own timeline while your life sits on pause. You are allowed to act. You are allowed to protect. You are allowed to get up and rebuild, quietly and deliberately, one phone call at a time, starting with whatever you still have and working forward from there. That's not hardness. That's not bitterness. That's just what it looks like to know who you are and refuse to let anyone take that from you, even when they've taken everything else. The roses come back in May. They always come back in May. But they come back because they're rooted in something, because the years of being tended built something underground that the winter can't reach. And if you want to come back after your own winter, that's what you need too. Something underground that belongs entirely to you. Something so established and so yours that no one, not even the people you love most, not even the ones who have access to everything above the surface, can reach down and take it. I found mine on a driveway in October with a canvas bag and a useless key and a promise I made to myself that I kept every single morning after. I'm going to keep keeping it. The roses are blooming. It's a good morning, and I am exactly completely irreducibly myself. That is enough. That has always been enough. You are allowed to protect yourself, not instead of loving people alongside it. Protecting yourself is not a betrayal of the people you love. It is the condition that makes it possible to keep loving them without destroying yourself in the process. The most important boundary you will ever draw is not the one between you and a stranger. It is the one between you and the people who believe, because of how much you love them, that you have no limits. You have limits, name them, hold them, not with cruelty, with clarity. There is a difference, and the difference matters enormously. And if someone you love has taken something from you, your money, your dignity, your sense of safety in your own home, you are not obligated to absorb it and call it love. You are not obligated to wait for them to come back to you on their own timeline while your life sits on pause. You are allowed to act. You are allowed to protect. You are allowed to get up and rebuild, quietly and deliberately, one phone call at a time, starting with whatever you still have and working forward from there. That's not hardness. That's not bitterness. That's just what it looks like to know who you are and refuse to let anyone take that from you, even when they've taken everything else. The roses come back in May. They always come back in May. But they come back because they're rooted in something, because the years of being tended built something underground that the winter can't reach. And if you want to come back after your own winter, that's what you need too. Something underground that belongs entirely to you. Something so established and so yours that no one, not even the people you love most, not even the ones who have access to everything above the surface, can reach down and take it. I found mine on a driveway in October with a canvas bag and a useless key and a promise I made to myself that I kept every single morning after. I'm going to keep keeping it. The roses are blooming. It's a good morning, and I am exactly completely irreducibly myself. That is enough. That has always been enough.